The bottle of whiskey sat menacingly on the old wooden table as if a sentence sitting in wait for judgment. Teenager Clementine Ross stood in respectful silence, watching as her uncle Rufus Callahan's shaking hands reached out toward it. She knew exactly what this bottle symbolized. Her own future would be bought and sold. But what was a child's future worth, and who would pay for it? The Red Dog Saloon reeked of stale sweat and tobacco, broken promises. Clementine huddled in the corner under the cover of the shade, her faded dress draped over her gaunt frame, trying to merge into the depths of the stairs, each one colder than the previous one. Their gazes didn't heat her. They scavenged over her like vultures on dying corpses. She had sensed this moment coming, looming over her with every losing hand of poker Rufus played. With no funds left behind, he had begun to treat her not as family, but as cargo, animals, a means out. Across from him sat a man encrusted with dust and grit, as if the desert itself had shaped itself around him. His hat was creased, boots worn to the sole, and his coat clung to his frame like a second skin. Gideon Marsh, a drifter, a vagabond passing through Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, or so it seemed, but looks are misleading, and his eyes contradicted, too sharp, too observant. He did not visit to drink. He was observing and calculating. Rufus stumbled with his presentation. "She's a good worker, real quiet, won't give you any trouble." He slurred, his words thick with liquor. "All I need's that bottle, and she's yours." Clementine's innards squirmed. She yearned to shriek, to flee, to rage at the fear of being traded like a donkey. Where would she flee, however? The desert was cruel, and since the fever took her parents 2 years ago, Rufus had been all the blood she was left with, a man who regarded her merely as one more mouth to feed or a debt to sell. Gideon sat silently watching her. Beneath his gruff exterior, his mind ran at a furious pace. He wasn't here to just pass through. He was here incognito in order to see with his own eyes what his mining operations were doing to these outlying communities. And what he was witnessing made him sick. Children sold to get drunk, alcohol strained under poverty, and no one, not a single human soul, standing up to do anything about it. There was a sick quiet that hung around them as the saloon fell into a foul stillness. Men guffawed at the transaction. Others simply looked away, too far gone to care. Decency in Copper Ridge was only a specter that did not walk after dark. Then came the sound that realigned priorities. Clinking money. Gideon pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket. "That bottle, and $2 silver," he said matter-of-factly. Rufus's countenance glowed like a firecracker. Greed overcame whatever shame he ever felt. "Deal," he slurred. "She's all yours, mister." Clementine sensed the planet shift beneath her. In 30 seconds, her whole existence had been boiled down to the cost of rot-gut liquor and 2 silver coins. She locked eyes with this stranger, now master of her fate, for any indication, anything, of what lay ahead of her. What Gideon Marsh had in store, however, would shake the entire saloon and redefine Clementine's future. Gideon got up slowly, his chair scraping against the wood floor like a blade. The sound carved through the buzz of the room and closed it down for good. Everyone looked at him, and the trembling girl with him. "Come on, then," he said, voice calm, nearly soft. For Clementine, it wasn't kindness. It was a directive. Her knees buckled under the weight of her new life. As they moved towards the door, whispers accompanied them like smoke. "Poor girl," someone murmured. She'll be in a brothel for sure. No family. That's what she was born for. Each phrase sliced her like a knife. The air at night was sharp when they stepped out onto the quiet street. Drunks stumbled between buildings. Dust danced gaudily in the moonlight. Clementine expected he would tug on her arm, handle her like a beast. But Gideon just moved beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. Why wasn't he hurting her? Why wasn't he doing what everyone anticipated? The not knowing ate at her already beyond unraveling nerves. Finally, she could talk. Where are we going? She breathed barely audibly. Some place where those vultures won't be able to overhear us, replied Gideon, his head tilting back in the direction of the saloon. They stopped in the area of a water trough against the general store. Under the moonlight, Gideon turned and looked at her. Something flashed in his face. Anger, yes, but not at her, not remotely. Your name, child? He inquired softly. Clement Ross, she replied, trembling. And the man in there, Rufus, he's yours? She nodded. But then Gideon spoke something that would forever change the course of her life. She nodded, hesitantly. My uncle's taken care of me since my parents died. The word care tasted like a lie as she spoke it. Gideon did not respond immediately. He regarded her steadily, his eyes level, thoughtful. Behind that calm surface, indignation brewed, not against her, but against a world so broken that children could be bought and sold like cattle. He had witnessed poverty in his mining camps, but this was not the same thing. Clementine, he spoke low, leaning forward so that their faces were inches apart. I want you to listen very carefully to what I am saying. She looked at him cautiously, bracing herself for orders. You are not property. You are not anyone's property. You understand that? She blinked in shock. She was sure she'd misheard. Men did not pay to liberate people, not where she was from. But you paid for me, she gasped, still uncertain. I paid to get you out of that existence. There's a difference. Her head spun in confusion. None of it made sense. Guys like Gideon, hard, dark, weathered by the desert, didn't rescue girls from the sort of existence she'd been in, not for their own good at least, unless they stood to gain something. What is it you want of me, then? She insisted, retreating, her small fists clenched at her sides. Gideon had no time to respond before the swing doors of the saloon crashed open behind them. The sound shattered the moment like a shard of glass. Rufus staggered into the street, ran into the vacant whiskey bottle, and it dangled from his hand. Fury chiseled into each line of his flushed, puffy face. He was drunk, and beyond reason. "Where the hell do you think you're taking my niece?" Rufus bellowed, staggering toward them. The bottle swayed dangerously, catching the light. The whiskey had worn off just enough for a cruel realization to hit him. He'd just sold the only thing of value he had left, Clementine's labor. With her gone, there'd be no one to wash his clothes, cook his food, or absorb his violent moods. "You can't just march off with her like that," Rufus growled. "We didn't settle terms proper. She's worth more than a bottle and 2 coins. Gideon rose to his full height, and the benevolent drifter wasn't so benign any more. His posture changed, hard and authoritative, like an animal rising from a crouch. "The deal's cut, Callahan," he snarled, voice low but deadly. "You got what you wanted?" "I changed my mind," Rufus shouted. "She's blood. I got rights." Clementine was sick. This man had held her as a nuisance for 2 years. He had treated her like some stray creature that he couldn't bear to have around, and here, in public, he was playing the part of one who held family honor dear? Rights? Gideon's tone turned lethal. What kind of man sells his own kin for liquor? By the time the saloon had been emptied onto the street, gawkers had gathered in a rush. In Copper Ridge, sensationalism was not frequent, and a public fight over a sold girl was more entertainment than anything playing at the dime theater. "She ain't sold for real," yelled one fellow. "Rufus is just experiencing seller's remorse." "Perhaps they should arm wrestle for her," another called out, causing heartless laughter to erupt from the crowd. Clementine yearned to sink into the earth and disappear. These men were discussing her like she was a box of beans. And the worst part? They were actually correct. In Arizona territory, these girls were not protected. They did not have a voice. They did not have a future. Rufus, unfazed by the crowd's laughter, came closer. "Hear me, sir. I don't know you to presume that you can offer so little. I've fed that child, dressed her, given her a roof over her head. 2 silver coins is too meager. She's worth more." The lie was so blatant that Clementine gasped. She'd been the one begging for crumbs, making her own clothes, patching the holes in the roof to let the rain out. Rufus had spent every dime he had on poker and booze, and now he was rewriting history for an audience. Gideon turned his eyes to Clementine. He didn't have to ask her a word. The bruises on her arms, the clinging of her dress to her bony body, told him everything. She had lived, not existed, and no one had cared, until today. "How much?" Gideon asked, his voice even. The crowd pushed closer, the moment hanging like smoke in the air. Rufus's eyes were aglow with greed. $20. Cash. Gasps of shock passed through the crowd. $20 was more than most in Copper Ridge earned in 6 months. And Rufus knew that. He was trying to scare Gideon off with the amount. But Gideon didn't flinch. What he did next would leave the entire town speechless. Clementine stayed back a few feet, trying to figure out what had just occurred. But what came next would have Copper Ridge talking for years to come. Without hesitation, Gideon nodded his hand out of his coat and drew out a clump of bills so fat that the entire crowd gasped. Under the creaking light of the street lamps, it was clear. This wasn't change. This was more money than many of them would ever see in one place at a time. He counted out $20 deliberately and thrust the stack toward Rufus. "Done," Gideon said. A shroud of oppressive quiet swept over the street like a sandstorm. Rufus stared at the money as if he was afraid it would vanish. If he blinked, $20 would woo him for months. It would even be sufficient to buy himself back into the poker rooms in Tombstone or Santa Fe. But something in the readiness with which Gideon had handed over the cash made the crowd uncomfortable. Miners, drifters, cowhands, they lived on nickels and credit. Nobody in these parts carried rolls of cash in their pockets except if they had something to hide or something powerful behind them. "Who in tarnation are you, mister?" inquired Tom Bradley, the saloon owner, who had followed the bunch out. Gideon waved him away and went on looking at Rufus. "Take the money. Go away. This is the final time we are going to talk about it." Rufus snatched the bill so fast he came close to spilling his bottle. "Pleasure doing business," he growled, jamming the money into his coat pocket. Facing back toward the saloon, he looked at Clementine a final time, one of regret or calculation. Perhaps he was thinking he'd sold himself short. The crowd began to break up in a slow drift, but their murmurings lingered on the night air. That ain't no ordinary drifter. You see that roll? Something's amiss here." Clementine stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the shutting doors of the saloon behind Rufus. For all his cruelty to her, he had still been the last shred of the family she had ever had left holding on to her. And now she was all alone, a little girl in a new place with a stranger who had too many secrets. "Clementine," Gideon breathed, "I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me just a little longer." Trust. It was a word that felt foreign to her lips. When had anyone so much as deserved it? When had anyone been worthy of it? "Where are we going?" she spat. "Someplace safe," Gideon said. "Somewhere you can eat a real meal and sleep in a real bed." And now the question is yours, dear reader. If you were Clementine, would you accept the man who had just spent a small fortune to buy your freedom? Or would you take flight into the desert night and forge your own path on your own? Let me know in the comments. I want to know, because what Clementine did next would change her life forever. She looked back over the saloon, then out at the desert, vast, endless, and cold. Finally, she looked up at Gideon and really saw. Beneath the grime and the hardness, there was something that her uncle had never shown her. Concern. Real human concern. "Okay," she breathed. They walked together side by side through the deserted streets of Copper Ridge, heading for the sole hotel that wasn't completely a dive. The Grand Palace Hotel, anything but grand or a palace, was simply the cleanest place in town. In front of its doors, Gideon came to a halt. "Clementine, there's something I need to tell you. My real name isn't the one I gave your uncle." She didn't move, terror seeping back into her bones. "And tomorrow, when the sun comes up, everybody in this whole town is going to know who I am." Inside, the receptionist at the hotel, Harold Weston, looked up in surprise as they appeared. Harold had spent 15 years working the front desk. He'd had all kinds, but never a vagrant-type guy who asked for the best available and peeled off bills as thick as manure. "I want your best accommodations," Gideon told her, leaving a 20 on the counter, "and have the kitchen make up a hot meal, something appropriate for a young woman." Harold's glance flicked nervously from the stranger to the girl on his arm. Rumor had already circulated like wildfire through town. What went on in the Red Dog Saloon was now the scandal of the season, and Harold did not want trouble in his establishment. "Sir, I don't see how we can provide accommodations out of the ordinary," Harold stammered. Gideon's eyes turned cold, a thin line forming between his brows. "The child needs food and a safe place to sleep. Are you telling me this hotel does not provide either?" No, of course we do," Harold rushed. "It's just that—" He slouched over, words mumbled in a hesitant whisper. "They're talking, sir, about what's been going on this evening. Perhaps it would be wiser if you found other accommodations." The proposal hung over them like a poisonous fog. Harold Weston, the hotel clerk, had believed the worst of Gideon, that his motives with Clementine were as evil as the rumors suggested. His cowardice was masked in the guise of business interests, but the truth was plain. He'd do anything to protect his reputation than a frightened girl. Clementine's face flushed with shame. Even here, where she was attempting to conduct herself as well as possible, she was treated like something broken, unworthy, unwelcome. "I see," Gideon spoke softly. He patted his coat again and produced a brown leather wallet. From it, he placed a single card on the counter beside the forgotten $20 bill. It looked plain. humble. But when Harold picked up the card and read what was inscribed upon it, his face turned white. His hands trembled. "Mr. Marsh," he whispered, shocked. I didn't know. Sorry, sir." Clementine stared in awe. Whatever had been on that card had brought this snooty hotel clerk down to sycophant status in less than 10 seconds. "Your finest suite," Gideon repeated, his voice now commanding. "Hot food, hot bath water, and complete discretion." "Yes, sir. Immediately, sir. Right away." Harold hastened to attention and rang the bell with nervous urgency. Jenny, get up here right now." A young woman hurried in from the back, wiping her hands on an apron. Harold leaned forward and spoke low, quietly. Her eyes opened wide as well. "Down this way, please," Jenny said, grabbing a set of keys off the wall. "Suite 7, our finest rooms." They went up the stairs, Clementine's curiosity at last getting the best of her. "What was on that card?" she asked. Gideon froze halfway up the landing. "Something that's going to make things complicated. A lot." But before he could continue, heavy boots pounded up the stairs behind them. "Hold it right there." Sheriff Marcus Kane blocked the top of the stairs, hand on the butt of his revolver, his voice strained, his eyes glinting. "I'm taking you into custody for human trafficking." The air in the stairwell grew cold. Sheriff Kane's weathered face was etched with stern intent. At 52, he'd experienced enough shadows in his 2 decades as a lawman to recognize trouble when it came in on its own 2 feet. And an unknown stranger purchasing a 14-year-old girl? That was trouble. "Sheriff," Gideon said calmly, holding up both hands just far enough to indicate that he wasn't reaching for a gun, "there's been a misunderstanding." "Only misunderstanding," Kane replied quickly, "is you thinking that you could traffic a child through my town without consequences." His hand did stay close to his holster. "Clementine," he continued, glancing rapidly at her, "back off from him. You're safe now." Clementine stood frozen, conflicted. 2 men, one with the symbol of law and order, the other the weight of secrets and actions that could never be justified. The sheriff was supposed to protect her, but going back to Rufus was going back to a cage of pain and fear. Gideon had given her something else, kindness. But could she ever really trust him? Just as the tension seethed like a cocked trigger, Harold's shout rumbled up from below in the lobby. "Sheriff! Sir, you might want to see this before arresting anyone." Harold came racing upstairs and handed over the card Gideon had pulled out. Sheriff Kane did not remove his eyes from Gideon, but made a gesture for Harold to come closer. He took the card, read it again. His expression shifted, confidence giving way to confusion. "This can't be right," Kane complained. "I promise you it is," Gideon replied stubbornly. Clementine looked from man to man, irritation rising in her chest. Everyone knew something significant, and she was tired of being treated like a piece of luggage as strangers made choices for her life. "What does it say?" she pressed on, her voice cutting with urgency. Sheriff Kane looked at her and then at Gideon, clearly unsure of how to respond. The card had turned everything around, but it did not dispel the suspicion hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Miss Ross," Kane began slowly, "this man claims to be Gideon Marsh. Not any Gideon Marsh, the Gideon Marsh, owner of the Copper Ridge Mining Company and most of the silver mines in the Arizona Territory." The words hit Clementine like a sledgehammer. Copper Ridge Mining Company was not a name, but a myth, a legend of wealth, power, and riches in the Southwest. The man himself, richer than some nations. "That's impossible," she whispered. Gideon grinned and nodded. "That's impossible," Clementine whispered, staring at Gideon's scuffed boots and frayed coat. "You look like a drifter." Gideon smiled faintly, nearly exhausted. "That was on purpose," he explained. "I've been touring my mining cities incognito to discover the way things actually get done when no one knows I'm there." Sheriff Kane slowly lowered his hand away from his gun, but he didn't return it to its holster. The electricity on the stairs still lingered. "Even supposing you are who you claim to be," he said slowly, "that doesn't alter the fact that you just purchased a human being. That's against the law, no matter what your motives." "Is it against the law?" Gideon asked calmly. "To pay a man's debts to rescue someone from abuse?" "That would depend solely on what you intend to do with the girl afterwards." The air grew denser with each second. Guests had begun looking through faintly open doors. Jenny, the hotel maid, flattened herself against Kane's eyebrows furrowed as he unfolded the paper and began to read. It looked official. Seal of Phoenix, legalese, proper signatures. Something wasn't adding up, however. "These papers are 3 days old," Kane said low, his voice tightening. "Yet you met Clementine for the very first time tonight, at the saloon. How do you already have legal guardianship for a girl you've never met?" The question landed like a gunshot. Even Harold and Jenny leaned in, sensing they were witnessing something far bigger than a misunderstanding. Gideon went quiet for a long moment, visibly weighing his words. Whatever he was about to say would change everything. "Because I've been watching this town for weeks," Gideon said at last, his voice low and measured, "and I've been watching Rufus Callahan, and how he treats his niece." The air seemed to stop moving. Clementine felt her stomach turn. Had everything, her rescue, the offer, the money, all been part of a plan? "You've been spying on us?" Kane demanded, hand creeping back toward his weapon. "I've been investigating," Gideon amended. "My company brings a lot of income to this territory. I have an interest in seeing how that income is affecting the towns we underwrite. And what I found in Copper Ridge was disturbing." He glanced across at Clementine. "I saw a 14-year-old girl doing the work of a grown woman while her guardian gambled away every cent. I saw bruises on her arms when she fetched water at dawn. I saw her sewing by candlelight when the rest of the town was in bed." Clementine sneaked a glance at her cheeks, which burned, not with shame, but with a strange, suffocating mix of vulnerability and relief. Someone had seen her, not just her suffering, but her strength. "So," Kane pressed, "you had guardianship papers drawn up before you'd even spoken to her?" "I had them prepared as a precaution," Gideon replied. "I'd hoped not to need them. I'd hoped Rufus would sober up, or a family member would step in, or this town would do something. But instead, I watched a man become increasingly desperate and more dangerous." He faced the sheriff again. "Tonight, when I saw him take her into that saloon, I knew what he was thinking." Sheriff Kane looked for something in Gideon's face, then looked down at the paper again. "Even if everything you've said is true, you still disobeyed the law. You could have come to me, filed a report, gone through channels." "And how long would that have taken, Sheriff?" Gideon shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "How many more nights would she have spent in that shack while bureaucrats shuffled paper? How many more bruises would she have collected while we waited for Phoenix to care?" Before Kane could respond, A new sound sliced through the tension, rapid, uneven footsteps clattering up the stairs. Rufus Callahan exploded onto the landing, his eyes wide and furious, a shotgun clutched in shaking hands. "Ain't nobody taking my property nowhere," he thundered. The little hallway erupted into chaos. Rufus lurched up the stairs, reeking of whiskey and bitterness, the shotgun wavering precariously in his hand. Drunk, volatile, and armed. The $20 he'd gotten had already been spent on more liquor, and Dutch courage had affected his brain with violent regret. "Put down the gun, Rufus," Kane commanded, his posture altering in a flash, hand darting to his holster. "Put the weapon down, Rufus," Sheriff Kane ordered, drawing his gun in one fluid, practiced motion. "You're drunk, and you're not thinking straight." "I'm thinking plenty straight," Rufus slurred, swaying unsteadily. "That girl belongs to me. Her daddy was my brother, God rest his soul, and that makes her my responsibility. I've got legal rights." Clementine pressed herself against the wall, terror pulsing in her chest. She'd seen Rufus's temper, but never like this. Never with a gun. The mix of whiskey, humiliation, and desperation had turned him into a person she didn't recognize, a dangerous person. "Rufus," Gideon said calmly, stepping in front of Clementine to protect her, "you already sold those rights. You took payment. The deal is done." "I reconsidered," Rufus yelled, his voice breaking. "A man's entitled to change his mind regarding his own flesh and blood." Throughout the hall, doors closed with a slam. Visitors cowered behind curtains and locks. Jenny had disappeared, presumably out the back door. Harold was frozen at the foot of the stairs, too scared to stir. Sheriff Kane tried to find an angle, a clean shot, but the narrow staircase offered no safe opportunity. Any move could risk Clementine or Gideon's life. "Rufus, think," the sheriff barked. "You aim that gun at anyone and you'll hang for it." "Don't care," Rufus growled, his finger twitching on the trigger. "I've lost everything else already. Might as well lose it all." That's when Clementine understood. This wasn't about money now. Rufus hadn't come back because he was remorseful about the sale. He'd come back because Gideon had humiliated him, because the town had seen the kind of man he really was. His humiliation had fermented into rage, and Clementine, she was the only one he could still hurt. "Rufus," she said, her voice soft, but cutting through the tension like a blade. Everyone stopped. She took a step forward. "I'll go with him." "No!" Gideon yelped. "If I go with him, no one gets hurt," she continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "If I don't, someone dies. Maybe all of us." For a moment, her words got through. The shotgun wavered an inch. But Gideon had been waiting for his chance. "Sheriff," he said, his voice altering, "there's something else you ought to know about those guardianship papers." Kane didn't lower his gun. "Go on." "They're not just for Clementine," Gideon said. "I've started a legal fund, $200,000 of my personal fortune, to care for any child in this territory who ends up in a situation like hers." The number hit the room like a cannon blast. Even Rufus paused, eyes wide. $200,000 was more money than the entire town of Copper Ridge would see in a decade. "And more than that," Gideon continued, his voice steel, "any adult who harms a child in my care will have to answer to more than the law. They'll have to answer to me. Investigators, lawyers, security, years of hassle." He nailed Rufus with a gaze. "Ask yourself, Callahan, is your pride worth the rest of your life spent looking over your shoulder?" The silence was like stretched wire. Then, slowly, Rufus put down the shotgun, The rage drained out of him in a moment, and there was only a broken, bitter man left, destroyed by his own choices. "Keep her then," he mumbled. Tears streamed down his face. "Just take care of her better than I did." 3 months later, the Copper Ridge Children's Home opened its doors on the outskirts of town, a beautiful new building like nothing the territory had ever seen. Clementine Ross took up residence there and soon became Gideon's right-hand man in the operation of the business. Rufus Callahan left Copper Ridge the next morning and was never seen again. Some people say he hooked up with a wagon train and headed west to California. Others say he drank himself out into the desert and never returned. Sheriff Kane kept Gideon's identity a secret as long as he could, but before long the news spread like wildfire. The mysterious drifter who saved a girl wasn't a drifter after all. He was one of the wealthiest men in the territory. His example inspired others. In 5 years' time, a string of children's homes had opened across the American Southwest, each one funded in part by Gideon Marsh's mining fortune. And what of Clementine? She became a school teacher and an outspoken advocate for orphan children. She devoted herself to the belief that no child would ever again be treated like a debt to be paid or a burden to be sold at auction. Her life was proof that survival could yield to strength and redemption could bloom even in the darkest of places. And while she went on to lead a full, bold life, she never did forget that night, the night that a stranger with dusty boots and a battered hat taught her that sometimes heroes don't ride in on white horses. Sometimes they walk through the saloon doors, unobtrusive, watching, waiting, ready to change everything. Tee the wall as much as possible, eyes open wide, wondering to be elsewhere. Gideon moved hesitantly, cautiously, and reached into his topcoat pocket, with care not to have his hands in out-of-sight places where the sheriff could take offense. From it, he extracted a crumpled sheet and handed it over to Kane. "What's this?" the sheriff asked, raising his eyes into squints. "Legal guardianship papers," Gideon replied calmly, "signed and witnessed in Phoenix. I've been planning to establish an orphanage in Copper Ridge for months. Clementine will be my first ward,